Courtroom number 4 was completely silent. Judge Harold Bennett sat upright in his chair, reviewing the files in front of him, while everyone inside the courtroom could sense that this was not an ordinary case. People seated in the gallery whispered softly, and media cameras waited outside. The case name appeared on the screen. Emily Carter versus Daniel Carter. Emily sat near the witness box. Her face was pale. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly. She was pregnant, 7 months along, a condition that had weakened her, both physically and emotionally. But her greatest weakness at this moment was not her body. It was the trust she had placed in her husband, Daniel Carter. On the opposite side, Daniel sat beside his lawyer, an expensive suit, straight posture, and a confidence on his face that suggested he already believed he had won this case. For him, this was merely another legal process, something he could bend in his favor. He did not look at Emily even once. The judge struck the gavel lightly. Court is now in session. The gallery fell completely silent. Emily's lawyer, Robert Hale, stood up. His voice carried firmness and control. Your Honor, today we are not merely discussing a divorce. Today we will present evidence of neglect, emotional cruelty, and the deliberate abandonment of a pregnant wife. Daniel's lawyer rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. These allegations are based purely on emotion. Judge Bennett responded sharply. Objection noted. But this court wishes to hear the facts. Mr. Hale, you may proceed. Emily took a deep breath. For her, this moment was incredibly difficult. Every word she spoke could change the direction of her entire life. Robert Hale looked at her and said softly, "Just tell the truth." He asked his first question. Emily, when you were pregnant, did you receive support from your husband? Emily lowered her eyes. No, she answered quietly. I often had to go to the hospital alone. When the doctor advised bed rest, Daniel said he was busy. A soft murmur spread across the courtroom. Daniel shifted in his seat, yet his face still showed indifference. Robert asked the next question. Do you have proof that Daniel was ignoring you? Emily nodded. Yes. The court officer handed printed messages to the judge. One message read, I can't come today. Don't overreact. Another message said, You're always negative, Emily. The judge examined the messages, then looked at Daniel. Mr. Carter, are these your messages? Daniel replied coldly, Yes, but the context is different. The context grew even heavier when Robert Hale requested permission to submit further evidence. Your Honor, these photographs and call logs prove that while Mrs. Carter was attending hospital visits alone, Mr. Carter was spending time with his alleged girlfriend, Sophia Lane. A sudden noise rose from the gallery. The judge struck the gavel forcefully. Order in the court. Tears filled Emily's eyes, but she controlled herself. This was a courtroom. Only patience could win here. Daniel's lawyer argued, Your Honor, Sophia Lane is merely a friend. She has no relevance to this case. Robert Hale responded immediately. Then the court must ask why Mr. Carter prioritized this friend while Mrs. Carter was pregnant and emotionally vulnerable. Judge Bennett closed the case file and said, The court has also been informed that this case involves a 5-year-old secret which will be revealed in the upcoming hearings. At those words, the color on Daniel's face shifted. For the first time, unease appeared in his eyes. Emily noticed it, but she said nothing. She knew this was only the beginning. And here, I would like to make a small request. My dear friends, if you are enjoying this courtroom story so far, we have set a target of only 25 subscribers on this video. If you subscribe and help us reach this small goal, it will give us great motivation to bring you more powerful courtroom stories. Thank you from the heart. The judge struck the gavel once more. Court is adjourned until the next hearing. Emily stood from her seat and paused for a moment. For her, this was not just a case. It was a journey toward the truth, a truth hidden for 5 years, soon to be exposed. Inside the courtroom, the day of the next hearing arrived, and the courtroom felt heavier than before. Courtroom number 4 was once again filled with people, but this time, the atmosphere was far more serious. The whispers of the previous day had turned into silence. Everyone knew that today it would not be accusations speaking, but evidence. Emily Carter sat quietly in her seat. She wore a simple dress, yet there was more strength in her eyes than the day before. Yesterday, she had looked like a pregnant woman who had been ignored. Today, she looked like a wife who had come to court to claim her rights. One hand rested on her stomach again, as if she were assuring the child growing inside her that the truth was on their side. When Daniel Carter entered the courtroom, his confidence was no longer the same. He was still in a suit, but his face was tight. His eyes kept drifting toward his lawyer, as if he were waiting for bad news. The judge's words from the previous hearing, a 5-year-old secret, continued to echo in his mind. Judge Harold Bennett entered the courtroom and struck the gavel. Court is back in session. Emily's lawyer, Robert Hale, stood up. Your Honor, in the previous hearing, we presented evidence of neglect and emotional cruelty. Today, we wish to show the court that this is not merely a case of an affair or carelessness, but a matter of planned deception that has been ongoing for the past 5 years. Daniel's lawyer quickly responded, "Objection. These are assumptions." The judge replied firmly, "An objection only carries weight when facts are absent." "Mr. Hale, proceed." Robert Hale gestured toward the screen. A timeline appeared, dates, locations, and names clearly displayed. "Your Honor," Robert said, "this timeline outlines the relationship between Daniel Carter and Sophia Lane. It begins 5 years ago, when Mrs. Carter's marriage was barely 1 year old. A subtle movement spread through the courtroom. Emily took a deep breath. This was the truth she had carried silently for years. Robert presented the next piece of evidence. These emails and financial records show that Mr. Carter rented an apartment for Miss Sophia Lane while Mrs. Carter was told that money was tight due to business losses. Judge Bennett raised his eyebrows. "Mr. Carter, do you confirm this?" Daniel paused briefly, then replied, "That was a business expense." Robert Hale responded immediately. "The apartment bills were paid using a personal card, Your Honor, and the lease agreement lists Miss Lane's name." The color on Daniel's face shifted again. His lawyer leaned toward him and whispered something, but the damage was done. Robert Hale then called Emily to the witness box. Emily stood and slowly stepped forward. Each step was difficult. "Yeah." She steadied herself. The judge looked at her and asked, "Mrs. Carter, do you swear to tell the truth?" "Yes, Your Honor," Emily replied. Robert asked, "Emily, were you aware that Daniel and Sophia's relationship had been ongoing for 5 years?" Emily's voice trembled slightly, but her words were clear. "No, I only became suspicious a year ago, when I became pregnant, and Daniel began distancing himself even more." "What happened when you questioned him?" Robert asked. "He said I was overthinking," Emily replied. "He said I was hormonal, that pregnancy was making me negative." Several faces in the courtroom hardened. The judge looked toward Daniel, but said nothing. Robert presented his final piece of evidence. "Your Honor, this medical report confirms that Mrs. Carter had a high-risk pregnancy. The doctors specifically recommended minimizing emotional stress. Despite this, Mr. Carter left Mrs. Carter alone." Daniel's lawyer began softly. "Your Honor." The judge raised his hand. "Enough." The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Bennett spoke slowly. "The court is beginning to see that this is not merely a broken marriage, but a pattern of behavior. Mr. Carter, your actions have serious consequences, not only for your wife, but also for the unborn child." These words struck Daniel heavily. For the first time, he sat upright. He looked toward Emily, but Emily did not meet his gaze. Perhaps she no longer needed to. The judge struck the gavel. "The court requires time to review these findings. This case is adjourned until the next hearing." Emily stepped down from the witness box. Her steps were still slow, but something within her had grown stronger. She knew the truth was steadily coming into the open, and Daniel knew that the lies he had lived with for 5 years could not survive much longer. Under the light of the courtroom, the days before the next hearing were the most difficult ones for Daniel Carter. Outside the court, the face he showed the world was strong and confident, but inside, he was completely shaken. The 5-year lie he had hidden so easily was now slowly breaking. Under the questions of the court, every night, only one phrase echoed in his mind: pattern of behavior. The judge's words felt no less than a punishment. Emily Carter, on the other hand, was in a very different place. Before the next hearing, she spent most of her time at her lawyer Robert Hale's office. Files were spread across the table: medical reports, call logs, bank statements, and documents that made Emily feel as if she were reading a stranger's life. For the first time, she understood something clearly. Feeling pain was not enough. In court, evidence speaks. Robert Hale said to Emily, "In the next hearing, the defense will question your credibility. They will try to prove that you are emotionally unstable because you are pregnant." Emily replied softly, "If the truth sounds emotional, does that make it a lie?" Robert smiled faintly. "No, but the court must be shown the truth." On the day of the next hearing, courtroom number 4 was once again full. This time, the gallery did not only include the public, but also legal observers and members of the press. The case was no longer limited to divorce. It was becoming an example, a case of emotional neglect and deception against a pregnant wife. Judge Harold Bennett sat in his chair. It was clear from his face that he was viewing the case, not only legally, but also from a human perspective. The gavel struck, and the courtroom fell silent. "Court is in session." Daniel's lawyer, Michael Grant, stood up. His tone was confident. "Your Honor, the defense will prove that Mrs. Carter's allegations are exaggerated. Emotional instability during pregnancy is common, and Mr. Carter is being unfairly portrayed as a villain." A soft murmur moved through the courtroom. Emily clasped her hands tightly. This was exactly what she had feared. Robert Hale stood immediately. "Your Honor, this approach is based on stereotypes. We have already presented facts. Pregnancy is not emotional instability, it is vulnerability, and that vulnerability was exploited." Judge Bennett looked at both sides. "The court will hear facts, not stereotypes." The defense called its first witness, Sophia Lane. A strange silence filled the courtroom as Sophia walked toward the witness box. A stylish dress, a confident walk, an expression that suggested, "Shh." E believed herself, completely innocent. For the first time, Daniel sat upright and looked directly at Sophia, as if she were his source of strength. Michael Grant began questioning. "Miss Lane, are you in a relationship with Daniel Carter?" "Yes," Sophia answered, without hesitation. A quiet reaction rippled through the gallery. "But did you know that he was married?" Sophia replied, "I was told the marriage existed only in name, that they were already separated." Emily's heart pounded. This was the lie Daniel had told, not only her, but Sophia as well. Now Robert Hale stood for cross-examination. His tone was calm. "Miss Lane, is this your message?" A text message appeared on the screen. "She's pregnant, but she's overreacting. Don't worry, I'll handle her." Sophia's face tightened slightly. "Yes, that is my message." Robert asked the next question. "So you knew Mrs. Carter was pregnant?" After a brief silence, Sophia answered, "Yes." The courtroom stirred again. Robert continued, "And yet, you advised Mr. Carter to handle his pregnant wife." Sophia said nervously, "I was only talking about his stress." Judge Bennett made a note, then looked at Sophia. "The court must understand that this case is not merely about an affair. There is also an element of influence and manipulation." Sweat appeared on Daniel's face. This was the moment when the story slipped out of his control. Emily watched everything in silence. For her, the most painful realizatio was that this truth had always been in front of her, but she had doubted herself. Now the court was asking the questions she had never dared to ask. The judge struck the gavel. The court will take a short recess. During the break, Daniel and Sophia did not speak to each other. Robert Hale said to Emily, "Today, for the first time, the court has recognized that you are not just a victim, but a credible witness." Emily nodded softly. For her, this was not just a legal victory. It was the victory of the silence she had carried for years. And for Daniel, this was the first time he truly understood. The story he had been telling for 5 years was now part of the court record. And records do not protect lies for long. When the court resumed after the short recess, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had grown even heavier. What once sounded like mere accusations was now slowly taking the form of legal truth. Judge Harold Bennett returned to his seat, and it was clear from his expression that this hearing was no longer routine. This case was becoming an example. Emily Carter sat quietly in her seat. During the break, she had taken a sip of water, yet her throat still felt dry. Each hearing seemed to take something from her, yet at the same time, it was making her stronger. She placed a hand on her stomach and took a slow breath, as if reassuring her unborn child that she was not alone. For Daniel Carter, the break had been very different. He stood in a corner, with his lawyer, Michael Grant. Michael spoke to him softly, warning him that they now needed to be careful with every word. Daniel's face had hardened. Only one thought occupied his mind: damage control. This case was no longer just about Emily's accusations. It had become a question of his own credibility. The judge struck the gavel. Court will resume. Robert Hale stood again. "Your Honor, after the testimony of the defense witness, the prosecution would like to present another aspect: mental and emotional manipulation." Michael Grant immediately objected. "Objection. That term is subjective." Judge Bennett leaned slightly forward. "Objection overruled. If a pattern of manipulation is being presented with evidence, the court will hear it." Robert Hale displayed another document on the screen. "Your Honor, these are recorded therapy notes in which Mrs. Carter repeatedly stated that she began to doubt her own perception. She was made to feel that she was overreacting." Emily closed her eyes briefly. These were the days when she would cry herself to sleep, believing that perhaps she was the problem. Robert continued, "This is known as gaslighting. When a person is repeatedly told that they are wrong, that they are emotional, that they are unstable, they begin to doubt their own truth." A deep silence filled the courtroom. Judge Bennett looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Carter, do you deny that you repeatedly referred to Mrs. Carter as overreacting? Too emotional?" Daniel paused, then replied, "I was only being honest." Robert Hale responded immediately. "Honesty exists only when intention is clean. Here, the intention was control." Michael Grant rose from his seat. "Your Honor, the defense now calls Mr. Carter to the witness stand." Daniel stood and walked toward the witness box. His steps were slow, and for the first time, his walk lacked confidence. He took the oath and sat down. Michael Grant began questioning. "Daniel, were you financially responsible for your wife and unborn child?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "I provided everything." Robert Hale stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Carter, is it true that you rented an apartment for Sophia Lane while telling Mrs. Carter that you were financially strained?" Daniel answered, "That was temporary." "Can something temporary last 5 years?" Robert asked. A faint reaction moved through the courtroom. Robert continued, "And is it also true that while Mrs. Carter was hospitalized with a high-risk pregnancy, you were on vacation with Miss Lane?" Daniel lowered his gaze. "I don't recall, Robert Hale opened a file. "Your Honor, these are flight records and hotel bookings." Judge Bennett exhaled slowly. "Mr. Carter, not recalling something, is not the same as it not being true." For the first time, helplessness appeared on Daniel's face. He tried to speak, but the words failed him. Emily observed everything, yet there were no tears in her eyes now. "Oh," lie a quiet sense of relief. The court was asking the questions she had buried in her heart for years. The judge struck the gavel. "Court will adjourn for today. The next hearing will focus on final arguments and custody implications." At those words, Daniel's heart sank. Custody. He now understood that this case was not only about his marriage, but about the future of his unborn child. Emily stood from her seat, straightening her posture. She was exhausted, but not broken. She knew the truth was no longer just hers. It now belonged to the court, and Daniel knew that the game he had begun 5 years ago was no longer under his control. As the case moved closer to the final arguments, the atmosphere inside the courtroom became even more tense. This was no longer just about evidence or testimonies. Now, it was about a decision that would shape not only the lives of Emily Carter and Daniel Carter, but also the future of a child who had not yet been born. Judge Harold Bennett sat in his chair, carefully reviewing the case file. He had examined every aspect: neglect, deception, manipulation, and now custody. For the court, this was a sensitive stage. When a child is involved, the law cannot remain separate from humanity. Emily sat quietly in her seat. Her breathing was slow, but her heart was racing. She knew that this day was the most important one for her. She closed her eyes for a few moments and thought only about her child. She had promised herself that no matter what happened, she would choose truth and safety for her child. Daniel Carter's condition was very different. He no longer sat upright, as he once did. His fingers tapped repeatedly against the table. The most difficult realization for him was that he no longer controlled the story. Every piece of evidence, every question, every answer was turning against him. The judge struck the gavel. "The court will hear final arguments." Robert Hale stood first. There was calm in his voice, but weight in his words. "Your Honor, this case is not merely about the end of a marriage. It is about the treatment of a pregnant woman." Mr. Carter did not simply ignore his wife. He made her doubt her own reality. Robert paused briefly and looked toward Emily, then continued. "The court has seen how emotional neglect and manipulation weakened Mrs. Carter, while Mr. Carter continued to hide his personal life. This is not just a case of infidelity. It is a case of destroyed trust." Michael Grant rose from his seat. His tone was no longer as confident as before. "Your Honor, the defense acknowledges that Mr. Carter made mistakes. However, we must distinguish between mistakes and intent. Mr. Carter never intended to harm his unborn child." Judge Bennett responded immediately. "But can impact be ignored simply because intent is denied?" The courtroom fell silent. Michael Grant answered slowly. "No, Your Honor, but we request that Mr. Carter not be complete. Lie excluded from custody considerations." Robert Hale replied firmly. "Your Honor, custody is not merely a biological right. It is a matter of responsibility and safety. When a mother with a high-risk pregnancy was left to attend hospitals alone, when her mental health was dismissed as overreaction, this is not just a failed relationship. It is a failure of parenthood." The judge wrote notes and took a deep breath. He then addressed Emily. "Mrs. Carter, the court would like to know what kind of environment you wish for your child." Emily stood slowly. Her voice was soft, but her words were firm. "Your Honor, I want a life built on safety and truth. I do not want my child to grow up in an environment where lies are called truth and truth is dismissed." A sense of emotion moved through the courtroom. The judge then turned to Daniel. "Mr. Carter, if you were given one opportunity to change your behavior, would you do so?" For the first time, Daniel answered directly. "Yes, I admit that I was wrong," but his admission came late, perhaps too late. Judge Bennett struck the gavel. "The court will reserve judgment. The decision will be announced at the next hearing." At those words, a small weight lifted from Emily's heart, though the waiting was not over. She stood from her seat and took a deep breath. She knew that whatever decision came, it would be grounded in truth. For Daniel, the waiting was unbearable. He understood that even before the verdict, he had already lost something greater: his credibility, his trust, and his identity. The court adjourned, but the story was not over. The next hearing would be the day when the court would not speak. It would decide, and that decision would not be merely legal. It would last a lifetime. On the morning of the decision, there was a strange tension outside courtroom number 4. People gathered slowly, but there were no whispers today. Everyone knew that what was about to happen was not just another hearing, it was the final verdict. Media cameras were ready outside, but inside the courtroom, silence spoke louder than anything else. Emily Carter sat in her seat. Fatigue was visible on her face, yet determination still lived in her eyes. Her hands rested on her stomach, as if she were assuring her unborn child that whatever happened, it would be based on truth and justice. For her, this day was not only about her own life, but about her child's future. Daniel Carter entered the courtroom with slow steps. Even his suit did not look powerful today. Dark circles under his eyes revealed sleepless nights. He took his seat, his head lowered. Today, he had little left to say, and much to hear. Judge Harold Bennett entered the courtroom. His expression was serious, the kind of seriousness reserved only for the day of judgment. The gavel struck, and the courtroom fell completely silent. "Court is now in session." The judge closed the file and spoke directly. "The coup. RT has reviewed all aspects of this case. Testimonies, evidence, witnesses, and expert opinions are now part of the official record." Emily took a deep breath. Daniel clenched his hands tightly. The judge continued. "This case is not merely about divorce. It is about emotional neglect, deception, and parental responsibility." He turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Carter, the court finds that your behavior toward your wife was harmful to her mental and emotional well-being." No sound came from the courtroom. Then the judge turned toward Emily. "Mrs. Carter, the court also recognizes that during this difficult period, you chose the path of patience and truth." A faint moisture filled Emily's eyes, but she steadied herself. The judge announced the first part of the verdict. The court grants the divorce. Mrs. Carter is awarded full legal separation. Daniel closed his eyes. Perhaps this was the part he had already expected. The judge continued. "In matters of custody, the court's primary concern is the well-being of the unborn child. Therefore, primary custody is awarded to Mrs. Carter." Emily's hands trembled slightly, this time with relief. For Daniel, these words felt like a heavy weight. The judge went on. "Mr. Carter is granted limited visitation rights, pending the court's satisfaction that he understands and accepts his responsibilities." Daniel kept his head lowered. This was not just the loss of a right, it was the loss of trust. The judge delivered tea. The final part of the decision. The court further orders Mr. Carter to attend mandatory counseling and parenting classes. A small movement passed through the courtroom. This decision was not only a punishment, it was also an opportunity. The judge struck the gavel. Court is adjourned. Emily stood from her seat and remained still. For a few moments, everything felt overwhelming. Then she slowly picked up her bag and walked toward the exit. Daniel remained seated. The verdict had been spoken, but now he had to decide the kind of person he wanted to become. Outside the courtroom, Emily took a deep breath. It felt as if years of weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She placed a hand on her stomach and whispered softly, "We will be okay." Inside the courtroom, Daniel sat alone, with the silence that remains after judgment, when the law has spoken and life waits for an answer. The days after the verdict felt strange for Emily Carter. The court's decision had been delivered, but life did not suddenly become easy. The sense of relief she felt while leaving the courtroom slowly transformed into a new responsibility. She was no longer just a wife, fighting for her rights. She was about to become a mother, and every step she took now was tied to her child's future. Emily sat in the small living room of her apartment. City lights glowed softly through the window. She held the court papers in her hands. Each page was filled with legal language. But for her, those words meant life, primary custody, safety, stability. These were not just legal terms anymore. They had become her source of strength. On the other side, Daniel Carter's days looked very different. After the verdict, he was left alone. The silence of the courtroom followed him home. His apartment, once a symbol of power and success, now felt empty and lifeless. The photographs on the wall, where Emily once smiled, now hurt him to look at. Daniel sat on the sofa and buried his head in his hands. The hardest part was knowing there was no one left to blame. The court had spoken. Now, his real battle was with himself. The orders for counseling and parenting classes were not just legal obligations. They were a mirror, forcing him to face his mistakes. A few days later, Daniel attended his first counseling session. The room was simple, soft lighting, a table, 2 chairs. The counselor asked gently, "Why are you here?" Daniel remained silent for a few moments. Then he said, "Maybe because I have lost everything," the counselor replied, calmly. "No, you are here because perhaps something can still be saved." Those words felt new to Daniel. For the first time, someone made him realize that taking responsibility was not weakness. Emily, on her side, was slowly reorganizing her life. Doctor visits were still difficult, but this time she did not feel alone. She had clarity. She began preparing her home for her child. Small things, a crib, baby clothes, a safe space. Each item reminded her that she was not ending a story. She was beginning a new one. Outside the courtroom, people continued to talk about the case. The media did not present it as just another divorce. They presented it as an example that emotional neglect and manipulation should never be ignored, especially when a mother and child are involved. One night, Daniel picked up his phone and stared at Emily's number. He did not call. He simply looked at the screen and then placed the phone back on the table. Perhaps it was the first time he truly respected someone else's space. He was beginning to understand that not everything can be fixed immediately, and that some mistakes are only understood with time. Emily thought about Daniel too, but not with anger. Her heart now carried only one focus: giving her child a better life. Forgiveness or revenge were no longer priorities. Peace and stability were. A few weeks later, Emily returned to court, this time not for a case, but to finalize documents. Judge Harold Bennett looked at her and nodded. "Mrs. Carter, you showed great patience and strength." Emily lowered her head slightly and replied, "Thank you, Your Honor." As she walked out of the courtroom, Emily realized she was no longer the same woman. She was not weak. She was not broken. She was someone who had survived and was ready to move forward. And Daniel, in his own way, was slowly learning that life is not just about winning or losing. Sometimes the greatest lesson arrives after the court has spoken, when the only path left is to change yourself. The story was now nearing its end. Only one part remained, the part that would show where life leads after truth and responsibility. Time passed, but the court's verdict was not just a turning point. In Emily Carter's life, it was a new path, A few months later, on a cold morning, Emily sat inside a hospital room. Sunlight filtered in through the window. There was exhaustion on her face, but peace lived in her eyes. There was no noise, no arguments, no long debates, only a truth she had protected. A nurse entered the room with a gentle smile and said, "It's time." Emily took a deep breath. This was the moment she had endured everything for. The pain, the accusations, the loneliness, all of it had led to this one moment. A few hours later, a new sound filled the room. Emily's eyes filled with tears. But these were not tears of weakness. They were tears of relief. She held her child in her arms. A new life, a new journey. She whispered softly, "We made it. Somewhere else in the sit." Why? Daniel Carter stepped out of a counseling session. The hardness that once defined his face was gone. He was not perfect, but he was trying to change. The court's decision had been both a punishment and a lesson. With each session, he began to understand that the greatest loss was not someone else's. It was his own. He received the news from the hospital. He picked up his phone, then stopped. The court's words echoed in his mind. Limited rights. He placed the phone back down. Perhaps this time he made the right decision. Sometimes the greatest responsibility is learning when to step back. A few days later, Emily returned home with her child. The home was small, but it was safe. Everything was clean. Every corner was filled with care. She placed her child into the cradle and sat down on the sofa. She closed her eyes. Scenes from the past moved through her mind. The courtroom, the judge's voice, the questions, the evidence. Then she opened her eyes. Those scenes belonged to the past. Before her stood only the future. A few weeks later, Emily returned to court once more. This time, not for a case, but for formal paperwork. As Judge Harold Bennett signed the file, he said, "Mrs. Carter, the court hopes you and your child will live a safe and stable life." Emily smiled and nodded gently. "I will do my best." As she stepped outside the courtroom, Emily held her child close to her chest. Camera flashes were distant. Voices were soft. This time, the court was no longer the center of her life. Life itself was now in her hands. Daniel stood somewhere, watching the city lights. For him, this story was no longer about winning or losing. It was about realization. He had learned that running from the truth is easy, but facing it is what changes a person. And for Emily, this story was not truly over. It was only the end of the pain she had endured alone. What began now was the story of a mother and her child. A story written, not in a courtroom, but in life. The greatest decision in this story was not delivered by a judge. That decision was made by Emily herself, to move forward with silence, truth, and strength. And that is the decision that gives life a new meaning. The story ends here, but a better life begins from this moment.